We're going to start by the latest, that it's at the same time the oldest book, because it's sort of the compiled works at this point. It compiles two previous books and is expanded with an anthology of works that I wasn't able actually to record back then, because my process was much more messy back in the day. And so it compiles works since 2012, when I was precisely still studying fine arts and this very Catholic university, which is a fun point that we might touch upon. The first one is the Handbook of Sacred Anatomy. Starts here, was a very small booklet of images that I published, I think when I was 21 still. And it aspires to be a silent book. It's only made of riddles, mostly taken from Polyphilos' dream, Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, and mixed with studies of human bones that I was collecting back in the day. And also it's some free associations between bones and glyphs and letters. So it's sort of a constructed alphabet, you could say, based on human bones. And yeah, some of them are also taken from engravings, mostly from the Nordic Renaissance. So Albrecht Dürer, which has always been my main source of inspiration, my sort of silent master, and a lot of Eliphas Levi was also very important in my process. Not specifically Crowley, which is what people always bring out when we see the Babylon images, but he was also there somehow, implicitly. And the Handbook of Sacred Anatomy was basically a completely silent book. There was little to no text, and that's why we have expanded this with introductions, trying to explain the conditions and the moments where I was living back then, when I created these two first works. And as I was mentioning, it's based mainly on work with human bones, which maybe we can choose this. So these are skulls that I keep in Peru, and they were brought to me by my friends across the years. In Peru, people do have skulls at home, it's a thing, and they actually keep them with different degrees of syncretism and different beliefs that vary. And so it started, the voice started spreading that I was gathering them, and a lot of people had a skull that their grandma had for some reason, and they couldn't explain why. They started bringing them to me, and my condition was, I'm gonna illustrate on your skull for free if you bring me a skull, and then you can take it back. And it started happening a lot. So many of these are also not in my possession anymore, because they belong to these people, and I just did my artwork and returned them to them. So that was a very fun process. I was also having an extremely informal atelier, so to speak, an extremely informal workshop in an old house in Lima that I was renting for basically nothing, and it was sort of crumbling, and then I could actually gather all my skulls and be free and do my artwork without having to think about profit back then, because it was a very sort of humble do-it-yourself economy, so to speak, for an artist back in the day. And this we compiled for the first time in A Second Nature, which was my second book, fittingly, which now we have included more of those skulls that we did back then, that I also didn't record back in the day. So I had to come back and ask some people if they still had the skull and if it still had ink on it and so on. But it has been a beautiful process of looking back at these pieces. And A Second Nature was a second attempt, less silent, a bit more thought, more processed. This is some other just pictures from my workshop back then. And in A Second Nature, it's actually a translation from what was my bachelor's thesis in the Catholic University, very much based on Jungian analysis. So this is A Second Nature introduction, and it was a retrospective interpretation from my own works, based on Jungian analysis and my own dreams, essentially, that I was illustrating back then. So I would say it's more of an irrational pattern that I have tried to revisit and reinterpret more in depth. And this is again the Babylon images. That is also this story of Pittis and Aristotle. I think it was Aristotle and his lover in medieval tradition. He's shown dominated by his wife, and it's an interesting image of irrationality. It is also taken from William Blake's Proverbs of Hell. In the end, he shows Nebuchadnezzar as in his bestial form, basically. But he still wears his crown, but he's walking like an animal. So those ideas of bestiality and the base materialism, what Georges Bataille called the base materialism of the body without any sacred consciousness, without logos, was sort of the exploration that I was going with back then. Also related, of course, to the corpse, which is precisely this idea of the soulless body and this confrontation with the ultimate problem. So these are the images of the cover and back. Semesilam is an inscription. I think it's very corrupted Hebrew that appears in the Abrasax stones, and it has been translated by Charles William King as the eternal sun, and that's why the sun is the image that you will see more often in these pictures. And basically that's why I call the retrospective that way, because if you look at them, the sun is basically everywhere. And we also chose one of them for the end papers. This is the parhelion phenomenon. It's when you see, it's an atmospheric phenomenon where you can see many suns at the same time. This happens in Tres Cruces, North Cusco. You can actually see, when the steam rises from the jungle, you can see many suns at the same time, and it's just a phenomenon that made me crazy. So, and also the sun is, well, esoteric-wise, a very often used symbol, so to speak, for everything. But at the same time, what I stress is it's not about the visible sun, it's more about the sun's symbol in these systems. And in the Apocalypse, we have this interesting solar phenomenons in which an angel with the key of the abyss is about to open the abyss, and when he does, dark smoke comes out of the abyss and the sun goes dark. And that also happens at the death of Christ, I think in Luke. When he dies, the sun becomes black at midday, and so on. So it's interesting how the metaphysical moments, the moments of revelation, obscure the sun or change the sun that is sort of the axis of the understanding that we have for the system that was the Ptolemaic system also in Hermeticism. So yeah, that is very much an overview, I hope, of Semesilam and the contents. He was, for example, my model Leo. He used to bring me a lot of bones. Kind of a crazy guy. I hope he's happy with his book. Back in Peru, and a lot of it is, of course, about transformations of the body. So metamorphosis is also a topic that I'm very interested in. Metamorphosis as well as death. So a lot of them are also permutations of the skulls. And the last section is basically how you can find the skulls in the Peruvian shores, just like this, unbroken, lying in the desert, which I thought was very interesting because it's where the sun enters the skull, and so it's like this solar intrusion of the light into the corpse. So yeah, I hope that is pretty much what I can say about this collected works, and I'm extremely honored that it's happening, because you usually get collected works when you're very old or dead. So it's really an honor that this happened, because people wanted to have it, because my first editions were very small print runs, very privately and you could say improvisedly made, and I'm really happy that people just started asking more after we published Yao. Where are the other books? How can we get them again? So because they had been sold out, the small editions that we have done. So we can move to Yao now. I hope we're good on the timing. So this is how the paperback edition of Yao looks now. This is because also the hardback was sold out a couple of years ago, happily. So Yao is a very different book, because it's one consistent, I hope, consistent essay on the Ophites, trying to reimagine the iconography. The Ophites are one specific sect of Gnosticism that may have appeared somewhere between the origin of Christianity and the 2nd century after Christ. And they had the extremely special exegesis interpretation that Christ was actually the serpent in Genesis. So Christ, not specifically under the name of Jesus, but Christ as the Savior, so to speak, was the serpent of Genesis that spoke to Adam and Eve, was not the historical Jesus. And in that understanding, they basically turned all the rules upside down in the little text that we know about them. which are mainly Origen of Alexandria in his treatise Contra Celsum. That's the main source that I used for this. Yao has 3 sections that try to summarize Gnostic worldview, so to speak, if that's a big claim, but well. And I also use 3 types of sources. The first section, the world as reflection, this is the work on the outside. I try to summarize the Gnostic problematics on the demiurge. The demiurge was a Platonic idea, basically the creator, the crafter of the world. But they took it to the extreme idea that the world was essentially created by an evil god, or that the God of the Old Testament was essentially wicked or evil, which to me in my early days made a lot of sense, because something simply doesn't add up for me in the Bible, and it just felt that the God of the Old Testament was somehow vindictive and completely irrationally wicked. And so the Gnostics take this idea to different degrees of extremism. And the Ophites are not the most dualistic sects. So one very common misinterpretation, or I think oversimplification, that is done about the Gnostics is, if the world was created by this evil god, then the world is wicked and everything is hell and kill yourself, essentially. I don't think that it's a correct interpretation of the whole variations of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism is an umbrella term from what has more recently been called early variations of Christianity, essentially. You cannot speak of one single church back in the day. They had simply different churches with different teachers that seem to be even mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, like saying there are different teachers, there are other people corrupting the truth, saying that you have already resurrected in this life. Who are those people? They were maybe the Gnostics, as in the Apocryphon of Thomas. Christ claims that when you get initiation, implicitly, you get resurrected in this life. And if you don't, you will not get it after you die. So there seems to be references to them also in the canonical Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles and so on. But for the Ophites, the denial of the world does not apply strictly, because what the serpent says is basically, you will be like gods, knowing good and evil. And it's not that the world is evil because this God made it and we are hopeless. The world is essentially good, but this God wants you to deny everything and worship him. So there is sort of a double game going on, like he's tricking you, I'm not. And the tale that we get from Christianity is essentially, no, they did get tricked by the serpent. I think it's an interesting double play there on who is actually telling the truth. And I mentioned I use different sources. One is actually, this is based on a Roman graffiti, a very famous Roman graffiti that is called Alexamenos worshipping his god. I think I included a very simple version somewhere here. Well, it's a very rough inscription of what seems to be a Roman soldier worshipping a donkey or a dog-headed creature. And we don't really know if it's meant to be a donkey or a dog, because the image is super rough. But Charles William King ventures the Gnostic interpretation that maybe it was a dog-headed animal that was a reference to Anubis mixed with Christ, which is quite wild. I don't know if that can hold on historically, but I just thought this idea is amazing, and I want to render it. And I try to be as much transparent as possible when I interpret something on my own, and I don't claim it to be truth, but I just think it's a great interpretation that you can make based on that. And also in the secret book of John, if I'm remembering right, we have Christ denying his own crucifixion to John. They meet and he says, well, those people who think I was crucified, they have been fooled. And it was all this mystery play that I am sort of engaging in. And some of you get fooled, and very few of you get initiation. So I think it was very interesting how also the figure of Longinus later became a saint, because there is also a Gnostic Gospel of Judas, very problematic, that may have belonged to the sect of the Cainites. And we also have, in the official Catholic Church, Longinus becoming a saint, officially, like he's inside the Vatican. So it's like, didn't he literally kill Christ? Then why is Judas the evil guy? So I don't know, it's just many of these ideas, reconsidering it from the Ophite perspective. Another main figure that we have in Gnosticism is Sophia, aspect of God, that she fell away from the hermaphrodite original God. And Sophia went her own way and lived her own myth. And interestingly, in the narrative that is recorded by Irenaeus of Lyon, the demiurge himself does not create the world. Sophia actually creates the world, and the demiurge claims that he has created everything. And actually, at some point, Sophia actually tells him from above, like, "Don't lie, Yaldabaoth," which was the name in this case of the demiurge. Probably a mix of Yao and Sabaoth and so on. So we have also many layers of distortion in these magical names that I think are very interesting. And this is also the most famously associated figure for the demiurge, which is the lion-headed serpent. In the Pistis Sophia, it only appears mentioned as a lion-headed power. We don't have the direct association with the serpent. And then amulets with the serpent with the lion head have been associated to the Gnostics. I maybe want to make a caveat to my own interpretations included here, that a lot of the gemstones that have been ascribed as Abraxas and as Gnostic, first of all, most of them don't say the word Abraxas, they usually say Yao, conveniently. But also a lot of them have more recently been called just magical gems, because the fact that they have these syncretistic figures does not imply that they were Gnostic, and there are very few ones that we can actually surely ascribe to the sects. But of course, how do you create that corpus is always an ongoing debate, and that's actually what I enjoy, essentially. And so Sophia falls from grace and is reintegrated into the Godhead by the cross, which is interpreted as the limit between the visible and the invisible world. So it's a symbolic cross that is not claimed to represent any historical happening, and she goes back into the hermaphrodite original God, and so on. And the third aspect is more interpreting maybe the tradition of Basilides, which was this Alexandrian Gnostic, who is credited sometimes with the creation of the Abraxas figure. Don't know how much. In this case, I usually use the term angipes, which means just serpent feet, the one with serpent foot, because that's the descriptive term, angipes with a rooster head. But the Abraxas association, I think it was done by Hippolytus of Rome, and it's actually a confusion, because in the texts and in the gems, when it appears, not always with the same figure, it appears as Abrasax. So there is a confusion of Greek letters into Latin that was going on there. And this is the Ophite diagram described by Origen of Alexandria, which was a whole system, it seems, that only exists as a textual source. So my three sources, to go back to what I was trying to articulate, remains more broadly as these graffitis that we saw, also the gems, trying to be critical about the corpus of gems, and also purely textual descriptions, because there was no artistic reconstruction that I could find of the Ophite diagram, and I have only reconstructed it from scholarly sources that make very, let's say, ugly versions of this. And there was a paradox inside, because the text itself says in the beginning, all the circles fit inside one. But then the reconstructions always have to include the upper three circles outside of the circle. So I've made some compromises to make it all fit. And the interesting idea to me was that the serpent appears in the center, but it also appears outside. So it's like a self-referential fractal image even. And I really like the fact that it ends with an astrological consideration, because there is also this in antiquity, the role of astrology and the role of oracles was pretty much what religion was about. What the oracles said about your destiny conditioned the rest of your life. And so there was this last reference made by Origen. They say that this is actually factually true, because when you look at the night sky, the greatest and the biggest and the first constellation traditionally mentioned is the dragon. And you have this great vision of the dragon across the sky. It was based on the poem of Aratos, the Phenomena. And actually the system consists in rising the levels of the archons, which are these animal-headed supernatural powers that I try to reconstruct one by one. Usually they are 7 archons, and the 7 archons may have been influenced mainly by Egyptian imagery that the Gnostics were taking into Christianity, into their version of Christianity. and they all are sort of inside this system of the serpent. And actually the archons, you have to escape them, but in order to escape the archons you have to worship them somehow, faintly. So to each gate of the archon you make an invocation that is somehow saluting them, and you're expected to recognize their names in order to pass their gates mystically. It is unclear if this is an initiation that they made in this life, or if this was something that you were meant to be able to repeat once you were dead and you were actually crossing the world. It was also paired with probable Gnostic beliefs in reincarnation that were shared with the Orphic tradition, and also there are hints of beliefs in reincarnation in Hermeticism. And actually the belief in Hermeticism was literally that you reincarnate in the animal where you sort of cannot cross anymore. So it's basically like a lottery of animals to go back. So I just thought that was super interesting, because there was no imagery developed from that, and the text was so rich in images, but we only have either the very rough gemstones or the textual descriptions, and that's why I wanted to develop this reading. And lastly, you have the eons, and the eons are these sort of metaphysical levels that are between the initiate and God, but they can also be interpreted as different layers of the Godhead. They have also been connected to the later Kabbalistic system. We don't know how much this and the Neoplatonic tradition were connected with Kabbalah. That is maybe a bigger question, but also one interesting fact is that the eons are not consistent. The different texts mention different names and different numbers of eons, so maybe they actually depended on specific initiations of each teacher and so on. But yeah, I hope that makes any sense, and that I haven't just gone astray from the topic. And thanks again so much, and I hope you like the books. So.
Any chance of a tarot deck?
I don't know. I actually did one, but I'm not daring to publish it because I don't know if it works. So I think it's maybe too much. I feel I'm not prepared for that, but who knows?
Have you felt like doing the artwork to relation to present-day Gnostic groups, or is that not really relevant, or is that? You should see where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm. I have actually not engaged with present-day Gnostic groups personally, because I've always been on my own, so to speak.
Oh, so have you engaged with present-day ones?
No, not really.
No.
I have developed this completely on my own, and
oh, fine, yeah.
To a certain extent because of my own decision. But yeah, I know there is more going on, but I prefer to keep it sort of independent.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, I see what you. Well, thank you very much.
I, as soon as I kind of picked up your book earlier as well, just found looking through your art to be this kind of very amazing exploration of your mind, of course, which is something I discussed with you earlier. But clearly a lot of it is emerging out of your kind of movement out of a very traditional, confined setting of beliefs and theology. And so to what degree can you say that your art is truly in somewhat a response to your inspiration of finding an alternative story to kind of the traditional one that you grew up with?
Well, I think that is very important, and maybe that's something I'm coming to terms with. Peru is very Catholic. It's very loaded with this image worship and this traditional spirituality, as you call it. And at the same time, my father was very Marxist and very atheistic, and he was always wondering, like, why are you so fixed with this rusty old images that are completely out of touch with reality and with our current world? But I just felt that there was some intrinsic visceral power in images that was not actually defined or tamed by the text or by theology. And that is why I'm very interested always in heterodox images. How, for example, the Catholic faith includes so many images that are problematic for the Catholic faith, but they have only been created within that context. So I feel images have their own life that is going on parallel-wise, and it's not one. No religion is a single coherent discourse. It's always like an ecosystem or a growing organism. So I try actually to move between the lines of tradition. so to speak, and create my own.
Like at Peru, there's different types of Catholics. There's Catholics who are into esotericism, then you've got progressive Catholics. There's different types of Catholics in Peru, like everywhere else. You know what I mean? They're not as like a single block. You know what I mean? There's different types. Some Catholics are interested in mysticism, and you know what I mean? It's the same. You know what I mean?
Of
Would
course.
you agree?
Yeah, of course. I think in itself, it's a whole organism, a whole ecosystem of different interpretations. And at least in Peru, the mixing with syncretistic ideas, and nobody can actually tell which beliefs are native in Peru, for example, and which beliefs are old Catholic from Spain that came in at some point in the 16th century. So in itself, is a whole.
Yeah.
It's a whole multi-layered living organism. Yes.
So, what part of that organism did you find yourself in? How did you end up in a Catholic school?
Well, in Peru, it's by default. I mean, it's everything is permeated by it. And I was actually mostly interested in the Andean, so in how it works in the Andes, and studying the image worship and the beliefs, the syncretistic beliefs that they have. There is a very little degree of that in Yao, but I try to be very careful of not crossing the borders and keeping it between this looking back Gnosticism. But yeah, I was always very interested in that, and also how it goes locally, very much with a death worship that is very intense. You know, the whole fact that people keep the skulls, it's also linked with specific saints and practices that for them are Catholic in their spots. So it's a very complex space where I actually found it super interesting, because it's like it's there but nobody talks about it. So,
And I was just wondering,
okay.
the dog-headed one. Did you look at the iconography of the Orthodox Greek, the Canaanite, which they mistakenly drew with the head of a dog?
There's this Christopher, right?
Yes,
Saint Christopher is also
Any correlation to that?
might be with the Saint Christopher as the I think it's a Psychoprompos, right? It comes from Hermes also. Hermes is also dog-headed, sometimes. Akephalos, sorry. So with literally dog-headed, and it seems to have been connected with Anubis.
Okay.
But again, I love the possibility of it, but I cannot prove it. But of course, yeah.
So it kind of makes, just to elaborate on what you were saying, it kind of makes sense to include an Anubis-headed or a hound-headed person for this character of Jesus in the context that it was made, because sometimes that was used to be anti-Semitic, like people who were within, I can't remember where it came from, but people who had a notion of Canaanite gods as an outsider thing, as a Jewish thing, as a strange thing, would put a dog on the head of it. Like so, and I think that like Anubis and Jesus sounds like a crazy connection until you have that middle point of anti-Semitism and how people thought about Canaanite gods when they were from other countries. As I understand it.
And we have to think it's a graffiti. So graffitis a lot of the time are about mockery and are about blasphemy. Another very interesting one is the donkey-headed that I also include, because there was this early blasphemy. I think it's Epiphanius that mentions that there was a Jewish convert to Christianity that went out of the church, so he apostatized from the early Christians, and he drew a caricature of the Christian god that was a man with a toga and a donkey head, and he said, "Oh no, coetes," so God of the Christians with the donkey head, and that also seems to have been a very old trope to mock that. Also because I link it with the story of the prophet Balaam. Balaam is riding a donkey, and the donkey doesn't want to move anymore when the donkey sees an angel, but the prophet doesn't see the angel, and he starts beating the donkey until the donkey speaks to him. And so there was this joke, once their god spoke through the mouth of a donkey. So there might be many layers of dark mockery there. But,
The Talmud also mocks Jesus as the son of the dog.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't know. It's more material to go on. Yeah. But I actually, at this point, would like to state I have no interest in open blasphemy, so to speak. I try to keep it respectful to every source somehow, and try to contemplate the aspects that are heterodox but at the same time constructive to me, because going beyond the caricature. And that's why I didn't stick with the interpretation that the crucified was a donkey head, because in that case it was only a Roman mocking a Christian. But the case that this could be instead a Gnostic devotee with a dog head that was somehow a devout construction looked to me much more interesting. So.
Could you tell me a little bit more about that Nordic Renaissance engraver that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to remember his name.
Dürer, Albrecht Dürer.
Albrecht.
Yeah. Well, I started copying his engravings, basically, my whole youth, and that's where I moved from. Because I had a big book of his engravings at home that my father gave me when I was a kid, and I was like, it just looked at the coolest stuff I had ever seen. And that is where I actually took my style somehow, mimicking his stuff.
Did you carry any motifs over that you identified with as well as like technique?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, Dürer in itself is not only the technique, but it's a whole language of Renaissance symbols that is very loaded. Well, he was also pretty much in connection with the Italian humanism, so yes, absolutely. Yes, for all. So, yeah.
For an aspiring artist, would you have any advice of more examples to study? Drawer, for example, but any in addition for, it's hard to create a style as unique as perhaps yours is. It's quite a refreshing visual impact that it has.
Well, the interesting thing is I never claimed it to be unique. I don't want to be original.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make the finest version of something. That's why everything is loaded with sources, because I'm not claiming to be the first version of anything. So actually, if I could make some point, is like not to over idolize this idea of originality that we have now, and that is, I think it's a very problematic idea within only modern art, that you have to be the first one doing something. And it really gets, I think we are past the point that it's tired, and we are actually coming back all the time. And if you see, most art is more like a language. It's more like a system that people recycle all the time and construct their own versions. So it's just, I think it's the problem is speaking with your own voice inside of that language, instead of wanting to discover the sun, because that's not gonna take us anywhere. But yeah, I think it's very abstract, but that's what I can formulate.
Thank you.
To what extent could you say that it's somewhat evident, but to what extent could you say that your artistic expression is an exploration of your own spirituality and your journey through that?
I don't know, because I don't want to make big claims about my art. Like, one thing I like to say is I never sell magic, so to speak. I try to articulate a discourse, especially with Yao as consciously as I can. So it is certainly my own. Yao is sort of my conscious essay on trying to construct my own interpretation of Christianity, as wild as that might be. But at the same time, I don't claim it to be spiritually relevant or spiritually significant. It's more of a conscious attempt of saying, what if? And so I wouldn't say it's fiction. I find it very hard to define what this is, essentially. I wouldn't say it's fiction. I would say it's creative art history, so to speak. So it's taking art history and saying, and what if we change the discourse behind it and we start molding this? But I wouldn't say it actually reflects a spiritual growth, because I cannot claim to have one. But yeah, it is what it is. Okay. Thank you so much.
As an also alternative vision of Christian art, it's like imagine Nicaea hadn't happened, and like the Ophites had become like a kind of an orthodoxy in their own right. Like, can you imagine a sort of alternative art history, or better yet, have you, in doing your work, have you noticed little flecks and kind of moments of Gnosticism in the canon, let's say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was part of the sort of creative art history construction. It's like taking the sources that we have and trying to sort of move the pieces of chess in the same thing. Still, the overarching question that I would ask to my own book, that might refute everything, is we don't really have any evidence to claim that the Gnostic did use image. or that they have any kind of icon or image praxis, let's not say worship. So it's a big what if, but at the same time we don't really have the step number one in knowing that they actually use them. Actually, in Nicaea, I don't know if the icon question had been established for sure. I think the icon issue was still around the 8th and 9th century, that you have John of Damascus debating on the whole iconoclasm. So I'm probably just refuting myself at this point, but yeah, I mean it's a positive imaginary version. You know, it's just like let's dare to contemplate these ideas without claiming them to be completely real. It's just like artistic license there, you know, if it's allowed. So absolutely, it's alternate history without wanting it to be factual truth. It's just my artistic speculation, so to speak. So of course. Please.
Earlier, you briefly mentioned your dreams, and I was very curious to hear maybe a little bit about your dream life, if you're willing to share, and how it potentially informs your art.
That is very interesting, because I stopped dreaming at some point. Like, I no longer dream for years. So I had it back in the day, and maybe I brought it to consciousness somehow. But one main figure that I had was the headless man, and that I started connecting with a lot of the images and the work I was doing. So you always find the headless figure all across the book, so to speak. And then I found also that in the rituals of the PGM, so the Greek magical papyri, you actually sort of do dream incubation, so to speak. So you do a certain ritual, and the goal of the ritual is actually getting a certain deity, in this case the headless man, to speak to you in dreams. So it was an interesting dream work that was going on there. And I think it's also very relevant for those who are into Crowley. You know, the Akephalos ritual was one of his first bigger rituals, and it's I think it's a big point in occult history that I really wanted to address back then, because I actually had it in my dream life, if I can claim to that. So yeah, but actually what I realized when working with heavy imagery is that we always do, because if you consume and you contemplate more images, they will show back into you and into your dreams. So to which extent your dreams are naturally made, or to which extent you construct them culturally, and I think you completely do. Like if you work hard enough, these images will make your dreams won't make themselves. So that is something that I started happening to me when I was doing my master thesis in art history, that I just had to surf through so many icons of the Trinity, that I just started having creepy versions of the Trinity rearranging. So I guess it's something you can do, but then you have the big metaphysics versus Jung question. I think that is something I try to address very briefly in Yao. That for some, in this case the perennialists, for example, the Jungian analysis denies the transcendence of the symbols. So the symbols that may appear in religion and in dreams, for some have a longer meaning than just the unconscious meaning that Jung puts into them. And I don't think I have an answer to that, except that Jung was saying yes to both things at the same time, because he also had an esoteric work going on that he didn't publish. So yeah, I don't know if I'm losing the track there, but trying to answer that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on Jung's Red Book?
On Jung's Red Book? I love it. I mean, it was one of the big models that I wanted to follow when making sort of a manuscript. The last section of Yao was actually done as a manuscript, and it's based on William Blake and Jung. And it's only an ongoing manuscript that was done, I think, in 2015 to 17. And it's sort of a response to William Blake, but also based on the... And it was a beautiful surprise, because I was in the middle of doing this when I actually found out about Jung's Red Book, and could after some years get one, and actually started enjoying the whole thing. And I think it's very interesting that there is this tendency to create illuminated books from the mystics working on it. That happened also in William Blake, which is what I'm trying to echo here. So yeah, and I think you should be recognized as an artist from the 10th century instead of a psychoanalyst. You know, it's why is he not in the canon is maybe a question, because the Red Book is just so good that why can people be both things? That's also the question that I would answer back. You know. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.